While the world watches Russia and Ukraine battle it out on the front lines, another superpower is pulling strings in the shadows, quietly, carefully, and dangerously. China. But why is China, a country with no direct stake in Ukraine, now emerging as Russia's silent partner? What's the game plan? What does it mean for the rest of the world? In February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, global outrage erupted. Sanctions were slammed down. NATO stood alert. The US poured billions into Kiev's defense. But halfway across the world, behind closed doors in Beijing, silence. No condemnation, no sanctions, no outrage. Instead, quiet diplomacy and growing trade. Was China truly neutral, or was something more strategic unfolding? Before the war, China and Russia were already drawing closer. Their leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, had declared a no-limits partnership just weeks before the invasion. Not a coincidence. Friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. They declared in an official joint statement on February 4, 2022. That was their message to the West, especially to Washington. And when Russia attacked Ukraine just 20 days later, China didn't flinch. Fast forward a year into the war and something strange happened. While Europe cut off Russian energy, while the West banned exports to Moscow, China stepped in. Quietly, Russia-China trade surged by over 30% in 2023. China became the largest buyer of Russian oil, helping Moscow survive Western sanctions. Beijing supplied dual-use technology like microchips, drones, and industrial machinery, all crucial to sustaining Russia's war economy. On paper, these weren't weapons. Make no mistake, they kept Russia's military running. So why would China, the world's second-largest economy, risk its global reputation to back a pariah state like Russia? Why not side with the West, or at least stay neutral? The answer is chilling and strategic. China sees Russia not just as a friend, but as a strategic shield. Beijing knows that as long as Russia is engaged in Europe, the US is distracted, financially, militarily, and politically. And a distracted America is exactly what China needs to make its own move in the South China Sea, or maybe even toward Taiwan. Let Russia drain the West in Ukraine. We'll focus on Asia. That's the logic. US intelligence has already sounded alarms. In 2024, leaked Pentagon documents revealed that Chinese companies were providing equipment, night vision tech, navigation systems, and drone parts to Russian contractors. All while China continued to say, "We're not taking sides." So what happens next? Can China really play both sides forever? What will the US do about it? And is this shadow alliance pushing the world toward a much larger conflict? We're just getting started. In Part 2, we dive deeper into how this covert China-Russia partnership is reshaping the global power balance, and why Ukraine might only be the first chapter of a much more dangerous story. The real danger isn't just that China is helping Russia, it's that they're rewriting the rules of global power together. Behind the public speeches and diplomatic denials, Beijing and Moscow are building something far more dangerous than a military alliance. They're recrafting an ideological front against the West. Think about it. For decades, the US and its allies dominated global institutions. The UN, the IMF, the World Bank, even international trade routes. But now, China and Russia want to change that, or break it entirely. And Ukraine is their testing ground. As Western leaders scramble to maintain unity on sanctions and military support, China has been studying the weaknesses of the global order and exploiting them. For example, while the West tries to cut off Russia financially, China has been quietly helping Moscow bypass SWIFT, the global banking system. Instead, they've ramped up the use of China's own currency, the yuan, in Russian energy transactions. It's a slow-motion economic divorce from the dollar, and it's working. In fact, by mid-2024, nearly 25% of all Russian foreign trade was conducted in yuan. That's unheard of. It's not just trade. It is an attempt to dethrone the dollar as the world's reserve currency, one silent transaction at a time. It doesn't stop there. While the US was focused on military aid to Ukraine, China was building critical infrastructure in Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa through its Belt and Road Initiative. Why does that matter? Because Beijing is creating economic dependencies, countries that will think twice before siding with the West in any future conflict. And who's quietly supporting this expansion? Russia? The two nations aren't just helping each other survive, they're helping each other rise. Now let's zoom out. What does China really gain by backing Russia? First, leverage. As Russia becomes more isolated, it becomes more dependent on China. For tech, for money, even for food. Second, distraction. As the West continues pouring billions into Ukraine, it delays or weakens Washington's ability to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. Third, narrative control. By supporting Russia's war propaganda, China is testing its own messaging machine. Chinese media has repeatedly echoed Russian claims about NATO aggression and US hypocrisy, using Ukraine as a case study to shape global opinion. They're not just fighting with weapons, they're fighting with information. Now here's where it gets even more dangerous. In March 2025, a secret intelligence briefing to NATO officials revealed what many had feared. Chinese surveillance balloons, launched near Crimea, had intercepted NATO communications, not for Russia, for China. This wasn't just about helping a friend, it was about collecting data for their own playbook. In short, Ukraine has become a live simulation for China. A battlefield where they learn how the West reacts, how sanctions evolve, and how public opinion shifts. And there's one ultimate lesson they're drawing. If the US can be stretched thin in Ukraine, what happens when we make our move on Taiwan? It's not paranoia, it's preparation. US defense officials now believe the next major conflict won't begin with an invasion, but with a coordinated information war, cyber attacks, and strategic economic pressure. And China is testing all of it. Through Russia. So the question is no longer if China is backing Russia, it's how far they're willing to go, and whether the West is prepared for what comes next. In Part 3, we'll expose how this silent partnership is shifting allegiances around the world, and why some Western allies may soon be forced to choose between loyalty and survival. The silent alliance between China and Russia is no longer just a regional issue. It's reshaping the entire global balance of power. And now, the rest of the world is being forced to take sides. Let us start with the nations that were once firmly in the West's orbit. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, even Turkey. These are not enemies of the US or NATO. But lately, their silence on Russia's aggression speaks volumes. And behind closed doors. Diplomats from these nations admit what they won't say publicly, that Western dominance feels overextended, and China's rise feels inevitable. This shift is subtle, but powerful. Take the BRICS alliance. Once a loose economic group, now being transformed into a geopolitical counterweight to the West. China and Russia are its core, and they're actively recruiting. In 2025, Argentina and Saudi Arabia shocked Washington by accepting BRICS membership. Despite US pressure, the message was clear. Alliances are shifting. But why now? Because China is offering something the West isn't. No lectures, no conditions, just trade, investment, and protection from US-led sanctions. To many developing nations, that's a tempting offer. In Africa, Chinese-built infrastructure is everywhere. Highways, ports, power grids. In Latin America, Chinese tech firms are dominating telecom networks. In the Middle East, China has emerged as a quiet mediator, even brokering talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. While Washington defends democracy and values, Beijing is offering business and winning friends. And Russia? It's the proof of concept. If Russia can survive, even thrive, under the full weight of Western sanctions, then maybe the old world order isn't as unbreakable as it once seemed. But here's the twist. Even as China publicly calls for peace in Ukraine, its actions tell a different story. Chinese companies have been caught shipping dual-use technologies to Russia, drones, semiconductors, even body armor. Not as military aid, but as civilian goods that just happen to end up on the front lines. When asked, Chinese officials deflect. We respect the sovereignty of all nations. But behind the scenes, they're making sure Russia doesn't fall. Why? Because a Russian defeat would send a signal that challenging the West leads to collapse. And Beijing cannot afford that precedent, not with Taiwan in its sights. Now here's where it gets chilling. In recent months, US intelligence has picked up encrypted signals between Russian military satellites and Chinese orbital relays, suggesting a growing space-based cooperation. Think about that. This isn't just land war, cyber war, or economic war. This is preparation for future warfare on every front, including space. And yet, the West remains divided. In Europe, leaders are struggling to maintain unity. France wants diplomacy. Poland demands more weapons. Germany worries about gas. In the US, election year politics are turning Ukraine into a partisan issue. Meanwhile, China and Russia stay focused, unified, calculated. This isn't a war of tanks anymore. It's a war of systems. Economic, digital, ideological. And the worst part? Much of the world is starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, China's system works. So what happens if the US loses not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of emerging powers? What happens if nations once loyal to the West begin drifting toward Beijing's orbit? And what happens if Ukraine was never the endgame, but just the opening move? It's no longer just about Ukraine. From the shadows of Kiev's smoldering ruins to the calm waters of the South China Sea, a much larger plan is unfolding, and Beijing is at the center of it. To understand China's long game, you have to look beyond the battlefield and into the map rooms of Chinese strategists. They study Western reactions. They analyze every sanction, every speech, every delay in military aid to Ukraine. And what they see is not unity, but hesitation. To them, the West is aging, divided, reactive, and they're taking notes. Because Ukraine is not the destination, it's a test. A test of how far the US and its allies will go. A test of how long democracies can stay focused. A test of how much economic pain nations will tolerate to stand for principles. And what happens if the West fails that test? The answer is Taiwan. China's core interest. Its red line. It's unfinished business. But Beijing won't invade tomorrow. It's patient. It's strategic. First, it wants to build a world where such a move won't spark the same response Ukraine did. A world where sanctions won't bite. A world where Western warnings no longer carry weight, and that's where Russia comes in. If Russia, a nation under the heaviest sanctions regime in modern history, can survive, if it can redraw borders and still trade with half the world, then China has its proof. Proof that the West can be challenged, that American-led order is not unbreakable. That force, backed by alliances of convenience, still works in the 21st century. That's why China continues to quietly support Russia, not with weapons on the battlefield, but with stability off it. Trade routes, currency swaps, diplomatic cover at the UN, cyber intelligence, energy deals. All of it designed to keep Putin in the fight and the West off balance. And while the world focuses on tanks in Donbass or drones over Crimea, Chinese warships train near Taiwan. Satellites pass over Guam. Propaganda floods social media platforms. Every front is being prepared. But here's the irony. The West is still stronger. Economically, militarily, technologically, but strength means nothing without resolve. And that's what this documentary is really about. Resolve. Because while China plays the long game, democracies often play the short one. They argue, they delay, they second-guess. And autocracies thrive in that hesitation. Now, the question is not just why China is secretly backing Russia. The real question is, will the West wake up in time? Will it see the Ukraine war not just as a European crisis, but as a global rehearsal for something much bigger? Will it stop seeing Russia and China as separate threats and recognize the axis that's quietly forming? And most importantly, will it rediscover the unity and vision needed to defend not just territory, but the very idea of a rules-based world? Because history isn't written in peace. It's written in moments like this, when empires rise, alliances crack, and the future is decided not by words, but by action. The world is watching, and so is China. If this opened your eyes to the hidden power plays shaping our world, don't scroll away. Hit that subscribe button to stay ahead of the headlines, where the real stories unfold behind closed doors. Drop a comment below. Do you think China's next move will be in Taiwan? Share this video if you believe the world needs to see what's really happening behind the scenes. This isn't just news. This is the new world order.